And then Sunday Times front page news section, as has been the case over the last 2-3 months, the FAI feature. The headline is Delaney used FAI funds for his 50th party, although that is not quite the story in the piece, which suggests that John Delaney was being investigated in relation to 4 separate allegations when he agreed to go on gardening leave. So the Sunday Times has established that the FAI had resolved to investigate Delaney over concern that he, 1, failed to use his FAI credit card properly, 2, failed to manage the finances of the FAI, 3, failed to control his personal expenses, and 4, made a series of payments from FAI funds not in the ordinary business of FAI made a series of payments from FAI funds not in the ordinary course of FAI business. So he was being investigated on those 4 fronts when he accepted that he would have to go on gardening leave, but they're still very much open investigations, we should stress. We're joined here in studio by Andy Dunn, formerly of Harlequins, Connacht and Leinster, and Shane Keegan, former manager of Wexford Youths and Galway United. Gents, you're very welcome.
Thank you, Joe.
Thanks for being with us. Shane, every time you're in, there's a Sunday Times splash on the FAI. You have the Midas touch.
I do. We're having a bit of a laugh as to whether myself and Mark Tighe have ever been spotted in the same room at the same time, because, third time I've been in, third time Mark Tighe has had a front page story about John Delaney, but as has been the case with all his previous work, this is superb. Seems to have managed to get his hands on the minutes of some meetings, or somebody who was sitting in the room seems to have spilled the beans. I don't know what the source is, but look, when you turn to page 4 and 5, if you were to quote all the relevant bits and all the bits that are worthwhile talking about, you'd take up the whole show and you'd be left with no article. But look, it's super stuff, and unsurprisingly, some people don't come out of it shining brightly again. Yeah, the nature of the paper review, I'm sure you'll all accept, is that we choose the guests well in advance of the actual papers coming out. We don't suddenly get up on Sunday morning and say, who will we get in today, and start ringing around. So Andy, you're not as on top of this whole area as others might be, certainly not well enough to force your opinions on the national airwaves. So correct.
We'll get your thoughts on what you've read today.
For you.
And Shane, you've been on the record, and I think appropriately so, because it's not right if media come on and don't present all the facts, as saying that you may well apply for jobs in the FAI in the future. And that is worth stating, and people can make up their minds on that, or how that might inform your thoughts on the story or not. You're not here as a journalist, you're here as a guest to review the Sunday papers. I saw a few people tweeting in last time we said that, saying it was crazy, but actually it's the reality of the paper review. We booked the guests early in the week, we don't know what's going to be in the papers, and we're just being totally honest and upfront with people. That's the nature of how it all works. So page 4 and 5 is a big piece. I'll hold it up here for cameras for those of you who are watching, and you'll see it's 2-page spread, and the headline is How Delaney Lost the FAI Dressing Room. And as Shane, you say rightly, it seems Mark Tighe and Paul Rowan have got their hands on the minutes of various board meetings, FAI board meetings, which happened around the last couple of months when the SH1T was hitting the fan. And so it makes for good reading and informative reading to see how the board handled this whole situation. So that's kind of our jumping off point.
Yeah,
Where do you want to start? I think maybe going through it chronologically might make most sense for people, because there's a lot in it.
Well, that's it. I suppose I think the two most impressive things about the way the piece has been put together, obviously it's brilliant journalism just to get their hands on the information they've got on it, but then it still requires serious work to make a decent piece out of it. And the two most impressive things about it is the way that it has managed to follow a timeline, and it allows you to, it almost takes you inside the boardroom on each of these various different meetings, and we get the key discussion points. And then it's also superb in that it's very, very much explained in layman's terms. Like, right, I'm involved in football, but I wouldn't be massively, into this side of it or all that well educated, but I feel an awful lot more educated on the back of this. Look, I suppose if you skip to the start of the second section of it, he kicks it off with on the 1st of March. That's when they initially sent the Times initially sent the questions in to the FAI. He skips forward then a few days to the 4th of March when the board had a meeting, and he brings up a couple of points that were discussed at first, before saying that John Delaney at this meeting kind of casually mentioned that he had provided some cash due to a cash flow issue.
March 1st, Sunday Times send the email to the FAI, asking about the €100,000 loan of 2017. So that's March 1st. 3 days later, there's an FAI board meeting. It's in Abbottstown. Delaney, he says, informed the board of his recent activities, including dinner with Kieran Mulvey, including addressing a dinner hosted by Western Care, a disability support group in Mayo. He said he'd visited Iceland and Latvia on behalf of UEFA because 2 local association presidents were in trouble, ironically, quote unquote, in trouble. And then towards the end, as you say, Delaney said there were 2 things he wanted to mention is in quotes, so they could be noted in the minutes. He said most of his UEFA salary would go into the FAI for 2018, that's $160,000 a year. And then he mentioned that he had to bridge cash flow, that's a quote for the body, quote, for a small period of time, and that had been repaid very quickly. An interesting point to note here when you're looking at the board and the job they did. Yeah. No mention was made of the query from the Sunday Times, and no director asked for more information about why the FAI needed the loan from its chief executive. So that bears repeating. He mentions, I gave the association a loan of €100,000, and it seems no director asked why.
It seems incredible.
Doesn't it?
It seems absolutely incredible in any organisation, sporting or otherwise, for that scenario to raise its head and nobody to ask serious questions. There is just...
We did get onto the FAI for comment on the Sunday Times today, and they said they don't comment on matters pertaining to any employees, which I'm not sure that's overly satisfactory given the circumstances, but they were given the right to comment on this situation. We should stress that. Fast forward, also in that meeting was the first time Delaney mentioned this Jonathan Hall report. Yeah. And this was the report which ultimately would suggest he take up the newly created position of Executive Vice President. So he said that would be beginning, although ultimately it transpired it happened the night of the Gibraltar game. It certainly wasn't planned to happen that night, as we'll see. So where are we skimming to next? When's the next board meeting? That was the 4th of March.
Yeah, they kind of jump forward to middle of March. I would just point out first though, there's 2 or 3 examples in the piece of how John Delaney was viewed by board members at that particular moment in time. So Pádraig Traynor remarked that if Delaney were not available, the FAI would need 3 people to replace him. Michael Cody, the Honorary Secretary, said that if the FAI did not act on Delaney's proposal, it might lose him, and that would be a disaster. So fair play to John Delaney doing the work of 3 men, because perceived at the time.
The piece actually opens with board minutes, we assume, from 2012, where Delaney had said, well, FAI staff who took a temporary pay cuts of 10 to 15% in 2012. This is 2016, sorry, but they were talking about the pay cuts of 2012. He advised that of the 10-15% pay cuts that staff had taken, maybe they could manage a 3% restoration. That would be about right. And then on the same day he left the room because he wanted his contract, which was due to expire in 2020, to be extended for an extra 4 years, and the board members all agreed that the extension should be granted and were complimentary about his performance. So he was he was very much on side, given that the piece is how he lost the dressing room. The piece fast forwards to March 17th, St. Patrick's Day. The Sunday Times publishes the details of the $100,000 loan. That's on March 17th. 4 days later, the Thursday, FAI board meets. At this stage, you'll remember the FAI, writes Ty and Rowan, had been issuing daily press releases in an effort to try and calm things down. So Delaney, according to this piece, remarked at the meeting that he and Carl Dervin, the press relations officer, believed the story would, quote, have died down by now. He said, and this is interesting for Shane Ross, he said he and Donald Conway had spoken to Shane Ross, the sports minister, at the FAI Football Awards on the day the story was published, and he had, quote, been fine. So Shane Ross, on the day the story was published, had been fine, but he reckoned Ross had obviously come under, quote, a bit of political pressure, as he had written to them on Thursday, seeking an explanation of the transaction. One board member said the media coverage sounded like a witch hunt. That was the situation. That was the initial reaction 4 days after it first arose in the media, the $100,000 loan.
I think the fact that we're getting quotes is great, because it really, the terminology used really puts you in the mindset of some of the people in the room at the time as well. You know, for John Delaney to have said that he believed it would have all died down by now.
Yeah.
And how long ago? What's that? How many months ago now? And here we are still talking about it. Just shows how much he misjudged how big that was going to become. Yeah, they went on to discuss the Jonathan Hall report, and John Delaney seemed anxious to make a move on that and start implementing that as quickly as possible.
Well, one member dials into the meeting and he struggles to hear, so he's obviously on a speaker phone, and he asked that the discussion of the whole report be postponed, and Delaney said it be circulated that day. He advised directors to read it because quote, in a nuclear position, the board would have to progress, quote, immediately. The member dialing in repeated, says Mark Tye and Paul Rowan, that he could not hear all that was being said. And Delaney said that the utopia position was to review the whole report and deal with it the following week, but time potentially was of the essence. So he talked about the nuclear option. And he also told them that there would be protest, quote, stuff. There'd be protest, quote, stuff in Gibraltar. He noted a Father Ted reference, which was the flag using Delaney's face reading, the money was just resting in their account, which is kind of comical. And Delaney said it would be uncomfortable in the small stadiums, given how small the stadium was, FAI contingent near the press and near the Irish supporters. So that brings us up to the Friday, the day before the Gibraltar game, when the Sunday Times are asking about the payments of up to €3,000 for his accommodation. And it's at 10 p.m. that day that the FAI have a phone conference.
Where are you going to me now? We're jumping all over the place. Yeah, I mean, the bit he goes into the conversations that took place that day. I think
I have it here. Sorry. So 10 p.m. that day, Conway opens the call. This is all by conference call, and says that he wants to sign off on the whole report that created the position of executive vice president. Delaney told the board the move would, quote, take the heat off and resolve current issues. So, I mean, it's funny, like, this is all as we suspected. Yep. You know, on the outside, when you're looking at the timing of the whole report, it was done the night of the Gibraltar game. It was clearly to try and get the heat off them. And then you literally have a quote here in this piece, minute to the board, saying this would take the heat off and would resolve current issues. This was their thinking, even though it almost did the opposite.
Yeah, and if you refer to the piece below,
yes.
It gives a little bit more detail on that.
Yeah.
The headline just above it is trio decide best form of PR defence was attack. So the trio that he's referring to here is John Delaney, Donald Conway and Cathal Dervin. And yeah, that basically the idea was to put this press release out at the same time that the latest Time stuff was to come out. I think the phrase they used was to take the focus away. He assured, I think the he here is Dervin, he assured this strategy would force the papers to amend their stories about Delaney and the FAI, and referred to it as a situation which would result in a 0-0 draw at a time when the FAI was currently down.
I do like that the FAI are using football analogies to explain things. It gets us back in the game, is what was said.
Yeah, the other interesting part from that, if you jump towards the end of that meeting, it says that he here is Delaney. He said to the board, and then the quotation marks, he said the board stood together and go down together, which you can draw your own conclusions from what he was trying to tell them.
In this piece, Ronan Tye write that a number of members at this board meeting around the Gibraltar game to create the executive vice president role said a number of members said they had not had time to read the report.
Again,
you know,
priorities.
The way this was operating.
Priorities.
So we kick on. Next board meeting is on March 26th. This is the afternoon of the Georgia match. So this is the day of the Georgia match where there would be a tennis ball protest. And the board, it seems, are starting now to think.
Yeah, he claims this was the first sign of dissent. But again, you know, John is swinging as well. He's not shying away from it at all. He himself says he felt he could have been better defended by the FAI, as he could not defend himself. He told him at this meeting. At this stage, Jim McConnell, a board member, asked why Delaney had not informed the board of the 100,000 transaction sooner. Delaney said that senior people were aware of it, but I mean, this essentially is the first time anybody on the board has said,
what's the story?
Actually, we have a bit of an issue around this 100,000 thing.
Certainly that we're seeing in these minutes that are reported. Maybe someone said it earlier, but certainly insofar as we can see. And the response from Delaney, it seems, according to the minutes, was it was a good thing to do and it was a way to avoid any bad publicity. I sort of understand that. I do actually. That's the first bit of logic actually on this whole 100 grand loan that we've seen, that it was to avoid bad publicity. But it's still not acceptable. It wasn't in the accounts. You would have to say on balance, it has to be in the audited accounts when this happens. So, I mean, that's a good chunk of all these board minutes. Anything else then grab you as things progress?
You'd still wonder about the mindset of the people in the room. I mean, it says that at that particular meeting that Donald Conway asked Mr. Delaney to leave the room at that time, and they go on to have a discussion while he's not in the room. The FAI discussed setting up a board subcommittee to investigate financial matters, But it was noted John is not happy and has some nervousness about it.
Yeah.
So, we don't set up the subcommittee to investigate this because John might not be happy with us setting up a subcommittee to investigate him. Is that what's been said there? It is very, very strange. And the other really interesting part I thought from that was the board then instructed Dervin that he release statements only on instruction from Conway or Watch. So whose instructions was he releasing statements?
I presume Delaney would have had some say in statements being released. So that was the beginning of the turning, I suppose, in that they want to control the message, and it seems if we take that as fact that they wanted to stop John Delaney releasing statements or being part of those statements being released.
Yeah, also at that one it has here, Eamon Naughton said that while he knew of the loan, he felt Delaney had given conflicting versions of what had taken place. I think Eamon would be seen as somebody who had probably been in John's corner to a reasonable extent up until then. So, you've got people who are starting to finally maybe starting to move away from him at this stage,
It's a very interesting read. It does all tally with what you suspected was going on. A bit of troubleshooting, a bit of firefighting, trying to steer the media away from things. The Jonathan Hall report rushed through under the pressure. The sense initially that this thing would die down in a fortnight. Shane Ross going from saying it's fine to Shane Ross writing letters. The pressure building. Eventually around that Gibraltar-Georgia game, board members starting to pipe up and starting to say, well, hang on, why didn't we? When you think about it, why didn't we know about the 100 grand loan? Now that I stop and think about it, a lot of people are saying it's wrong. Maybe it wasn't so good. That it all ties in with the public. I was going to say perception, but the suspicions about how this thing was unfolding behind the scenes. That is the sense you get.
Very much so. It's the kind of article where three different people could read that and they will zone in on three different things as being the main talking point on the back of it. Really, depending on who your focus is on. Shane Ross, John Delaney, Donald Conway, there's various different bits of material there that allows you to have a crack at varying different people, really.
Well, it'll be interesting to see how it informs the current situation, the current impasse around Donald Conway's position. Dan McDonald, front page of the Sunday Independent. Donald Conway, and all the papers have this, they're all writing about this because they were at the EGM yesterday. Donald Conway confirming he's going to stay on and wants to stay on as president. Sport Ireland told the Dáil committee during the week they would prefer if the long-serving board member stepped away immediately following the spell. John Tracy has said something similarly. So, you wonder how the Sunday Times story today informs this current situation. You suspect it doesn't do the FAI board and anyone who was on it any favours, including Donald Conway.
Absolutely. I actually heard Dan talking on the radio station, on your own radio station, as I was driving up, and he was very good, obviously talking on the situation. He's well clued in on it, and he was saying, you've got this awkward situation where rightly they're trying to move towards, what's next, how do we clean all this up, but it's just so hard to clean it up when you don't know what it is fully yet. You're trying to look back and look forward at the same time. It's quite the juggling act.
Yeah, they adopted, I'm sure you may have seen yesterday, the 78 recommendations the FAI did of the Governance Review Group. This is a weird one because these are recommendations that the Governance Review Group put forward, but at the same time there are now people saying, well, this is happening too fast, and I'm not sure why it's happening too fast, these 78 recommendations, but certainly various people have made that point that it's all been rushed through, maybe in a bid to preempt some of the reports that are going to come out and won't reflect favourably on the FAI. The Mazars report, writes Dan, could be ready by August or September, and there is a Sport Ireland commissioned audit as well, which has been carried out by a Northern Irish firm. September being talked about as a prospective date there, because adopting all these 78 proposals was one of the steps necessary, writes Dan, for the restoration of government funding. But, he says, Sport Ireland's appearance in front of the Oireachtas Committee last Wednesday made it clear that there are more hurdles to jump, and Conway accepted that yesterday. So I don't know what happens with Sport Ireland funding if they adopt the 78 proposals, but they don't want Conway to stay on and Conway decides to stay on. They haven't actually been clear whether or not that means funding gets halted.
Yeah, and I think it's important to mention, as Dan does in the article, that there's different people coming down on different sides of the Donald Conway thing. I think a lot are coming down on one particular side, the side of that he shouldn't have any involvement going forward. But Dan does bring up the point that the Governance Review Group, a joint venture between Sport Ireland and the FAI, recommended that up to 2 serving board members stay on for an interim period of 12 months. So okay, lads, if you don't want it to be Donald Conway, it's going to be somebody.
Yeah.
Somebody has to stick around here, because you can't have nobody who knew what was going on in the last regime, in the new setup. So, I mean, if Donald Conway's intentions are to be one of those two people for that 12-month period, then, I think that may possibly actually be a good thing in a roundabout way.
I don't see it as outlandish.
Yeah.
Certainly.
Yeah. I mean, that the makeup of that board obviously is going to be probably the key thing that comes out from the 78 recommendations. Again, Dan gives us a bit of information in the makeup of that board. I think the key part will be the 4 independent members. It's going to be really, really interesting to see who they have there, because they are the people who are, you'd imagine, going to come in with absolutely no baggage and who could really, really bring some new thinking to the whole thing. So it's going to be very important to see that. I've also recommended at least 4 females, again, which is probably a very, very good thing. So yeah, all change and no change, I suppose.
People will read that and they'll get a sense of how the board was operating. Any final thoughts to make on it?
Look, I don't know. You hear so much. The one thing I've said before is, look, probably even more, to be fully honest about it, it's even more so, okay, you've said at the start that I may apply for FAI jobs. I'm actually doing bits and pieces for them here and there, which leads you into contact with a lot of FAI staff at the moment. And like, the whole thing, I know we're talking about the top level here, but there are some incredible people involved at grassroots level.
Yeah.
People who, okay, it's probably been dragging on a while now, it's probably even more than 2 years ago, but 3-4 years ago, would knock you down with their enthusiasm, and who you'd think are set to change the world in favour of the FAI. And they're drained. They're absolutely drained. Morale is just incredibly on the floor.
I heard that from a few different people.
It's amazing. It really is. And something has to happen to get all this moving back in the right direction, because at the moment it seems like we could be doing a Sunday paper review in 6 to 12 months' time and still having a conversation like this.
Well, your heart sinks at the thoughts of all these reports coming down the line. August, September, there's going to be a litany of them. Yeah. Okay, well, that's in the Sunday Times news section again. Mark Tighe to the fore and Paul Rowan on the very front page, and within. That 2-page spread is a really good read if you want to get... We've done our best to try and break it down. It's obviously fairly heavy going and can be hard to digest on the radio, but basically it is a snapshot of pretty much, 5, 6, 7 board meetings from the start of March when this whole thing blew up, and the various reactions from people and how they tried to salvage the thing, and then how around the Georgia game things turned on John Delaney, and ultimately gardening leave was suggested. So that's on page 4 and 5 of the main section as opposed to the sports section.
The one, Joe, just very quickly, the only part we didn't mention on it, of course, which is also on the front page, is the bit about the guards being called in to possibly try and hack into a WhatsApp group.
Oh yeah.
So yeah, they just touch on that as well, that the WhatsApp group set up by some supporters. They actually named 2 of the supporters. The reason I bring it up is one I'd know very well. One is a guy involved with Galway United who would have been quite decent to me when I was up there. And yeah, it appears as though the FAI managed to persuade the guards that, I don't know, potentially John might be in a bit of bother, and that's why it would have been worthwhile hacking into this WhatsApp group to see what they were saying around the protest and make sure there was no plans to get at him, I suppose, really.
Yeah, okay. There's various strands to this. That's FAI for this Sunday. I suspect not the last Sunday.